The Spartan Army is a fascinating piece of military history. Certainly, the deeds of its individual soldiers and commanders make for compelling stories. But in reality, it is the features of the organism as a whole that made it exceptional. This is something that is best understood with practical examples at scale. From its army organization, to its organized means of encampment, and its disciplined advance into battle. So today, let us bring all this and more to life with the true size of a Spartan army. In this history documentary, we'll be showing you how to build an army organization from the ground level up, but you can build your own team of warriors and champions through today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, available on mobile and PC. I've actually enjoyed playing Raid in the past as an easy and addictive way to scratch my itch when it comes to dungeon diving, boss fights, and arena battles. Lately, however, I haven't been grinding as hard. So if you're like me, or are new to the game, a quick lesson might be needed to catch up on cool new features from the past year.
Professor Death Knight here from Teleria University, legally not a school, with a math problem. If you create a hit mobile game in 2019, how many champions will you have now? Over 700! Not only does Raid have hundreds of rad champions, it also has 15 amazing factions. Faction Pop Quiz. Can you name the latest faction? If you said the elusive Sylvan Watchers, you're right! Okay, class, any questions?
Does the game still get regular updates?
Yes, definitely.
Can I still explore tons of diverse dungeons?
I gotta say, yes.
Are boss mechanics still super interesting?
You know the answer is yes.
Do you have some examples of this?
Okay, class, if we can all turn to page 246 in your textbooks.
Alright, so I see here the newest boss is Akamura, the Phantom Shogun, whose enfeebled debuff makes you deal weak hits, and each weak hit only makes him stronger, and that it's a hard fight, but if I beat him, I get everything I need for Accessory Ascension, a new feature that allows you to upgrade your gear to even greater heights. And I also see here you've slipped in a note that all 10 episodes of the animated limited series Call of the Arbiter are now live on the official Raid Shadow Legends YouTube channel.
Hell yes!
Alright, thanks. So with all this exciting content, it sounds like a great time to start playing. New players can actually use my link or scan the QR code right here to get a free starter pack with this cool in-game loot. Once you're in, come find me under the name Invicta. So click my link in the description and enjoy now.
Before we begin, it is important to note that our understanding of the ancient Spartans is based on limited sources whose interpretation is the subject of continued academic debate. Even if we were able to agree on an army model, its form would never be able to represent every incarnation of a Spartan host across the classical period. Our army today takes as its basis the organizational structure described by Xenophon in his work on the Constitution of the Spartans, and will therefore best be understood as a rough approximation of an army which might be fielded around the time of the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century BC. Please keep this in mind as we are forced to make some assumptions and simplifications in this video for the sake of both visual and narrative clarity. While we will do our best to maintain historical accuracy, at the end of the day, we suggest you consult the work of experts for the best understanding of these subjects. With that being said, let us get started. The foundation of the Spartan army rested upon its individual soldiers. These came in a variety of forms, including the Spartiates, the Perioikoi, the Helots, and allied or mercenary forces. The Homoioi were the citizens of Sparta proper who were required by law to live in the central villages of Laconia. These now began to present themselves as a closed body of absolute equals, whose name literally meant the same ones. Even the Hippias dismounted to join them in a mass hoplite militia. Yet, we should note that this idea of uniformity did not extend to their appearance. For the most part, each man armed himself according to his means, with general trends in gear changing over time. Only in later years was there an attempt to encourage or enforce the use of the lambda blazon. The next group of soldiers were the perioikoi, whose name meant those dwelling around. Frustratingly little is known about them besides the idea that they were essentially free non-citizens which occupied the physical and social space between the full Spartans and the Helots. Generally speaking, they were a parallel to the Spartan communities that had parallel social hierarchies of their own. As such, in battle, many would have fought as hoplites, but others as light-armed troops or cavalry, depending on their means. Initially, such troops likely fought on their own, but would later be mixed in with the citizens when Sparta faced manpower issues in later years. The last category of the three groups were the Helots. To put things crudely, they were essentially slaves or serfs who were excluded from all parts of free society. Herodotus claims that the Helots accompanied the Spartans into battle as servants and even took up arms as light troops in certain situations. Together, these three groups formed the core of the Spartan army, which hailed from Laconia. However, in war, these would be reinforced and often outnumbered by additional forces from the rest of the Peloponnese or the wider Greek world in the form of allies and mercenaries. One community worth noting among these were the Skiratai, which inhabited the mountainous region just to the north of the Valley of Laconia. As stalwart allies to the Spartans, they could be counted upon to answer the call to war. In what capacity they did so may have changed over the years and is open to interpretation. This ranges from acting as foot or mounted skirmishers, which screened the main army, to regular hoplites which anchored the left flank. With these atomic units of the Spartan army now defined, let us begin to build up its organizational structure. At the lowest level, there existed several groups of soldiers which are not organizational units with their own officers, but which will nonetheless be worth mentioning. For instance, there is a near-universal military concept of a tent group, would have existed as a matter of practical necessity. Xenophon, in his description of later mercenary armies, conveniently names them for us as the siskanoi, or tent mates. This would likely have been a handful of men who shared a shelter or encamped close enough to cook together. However, overlapping with this was a system of mess groups. These syssitia, as they were called, existed across other Greek societies, but it was the Spartans who most formalized this practice. Here, around 15 men from across the various age groups were admitted into a mess group on condition that they uphold their regular contributions, which Plutarch describes as consisting of barley meal, wine, cheese and figs, and a sum of money for fish or meat. It was within these social groups that Spartans bonded with their peers, learned from their elders, and were thus molded to the standards of their society. Such mess groups presumably marched and fought together. As a result, they would likely have had greater social pressure and motivation to perform well than if they had been placed with others of a more distant connection within their polis. This foundational concept would have contributed to the overall performance of the Spartan army. One final group worth mentioning would be the file. This is a generic military term which refers to any number of troops drawn up in a line, one behind the other as in a column. Within the context of antiquity, files would be the formations which walked together and formed up into their blocks of fighting units in battle. The size of a file varied greatly from around 6 to 16 men based on the needs of a particular situation. For reference, we will now present a description of file drill described by Xenophon, though please note that he does so in the context of a later, non-Spartan army. Here, 16 men approach the battle line. Their front man leads them to a spot on the right. The next leader of 16 men deploys similarly to his left, leaving a gap between their columns. This continues on in a regular pattern for the entire unit. The gaps will then be filled by a process known as doubling. Here, each column of men will split in half, with the rear portion advancing to the front. If needed, this process will be repeated until the desired formation is achieved. Thus we see the interplay of both frontage and depth that can be achieved by the manipulation of the file. In practice, the movement of a file is a relatively simple process of follow the leader without much need for extended training. In most Greek militias, the role of a file leader seems to have been a rather ad hoc responsibility adopted by the best men of a file, rather than any specially trained officer. However, the Spartans and the troops they commanded paid more attention to this practice than their peers. Xenophon comments on this as follows, quote, "For in the Spartan order, the front rank men are all leaders, so that each file has everything necessary to play its part efficiently. In fact, this disposition is so easy to understand that no one who can distinguish one human being from another can fail to follow it. One set have the privilege of leaders, the other the duty of followers." But let us now move past these small groups of tent mates, mess mates, and files to introduce the first formal unit of the Spartan army. It is the Enomotia, or sworn band, which Xenophon claims consisted of around 36 men drawn up in 3 to 6 files abreast, and which would have been commanded by an Enomotakos. While we have chosen to depict this leader in a visually distinct manner, there is little evidence to support the idea that such officers carried unique kit which set them apart from their peers. Returning to the overall unit, we should remark that while Spartan citizen numbers remained healthy, these men would have all been proper Spartiates, likely drawn from the same mess groups of the same village. However, as this manpower pool dwindled over the years and Sparta feared the loss of concentrated pockets of its precious citizenry, the ranks of the Enomotia would likely have been increasingly diluted by perioikoi, or even armed helots. In such cases, we may speculate that the core of a mixed Enomotia was based on the 15-man Spartiate mess group which we previously described. Accompanying such an Enomotia would have been the support staff and baggage of its unit. Here we have added a block of helots who acted as military servants. A common ratio that is often thrown around is the idea of there being 7 helots for each Spartan hoplite. This is a claim repeated 3 times by Herodotus. However, we should note that he does so in the context of the 479 BC campaign of Plataea, which featured a disproportionately high number of light troops. The Battle of Thermopylae hints at a ratio of closer to 3 helots for each Spartiate. But again, we must add the caveat that this was an elite force led by one of the kings, and as such likely had a larger entourage. For our model, we will therefore adopt the more conservative assumption of there being 1 helot per Spartan, which would be more in line with other Greek armies. Thus, the Enomotia here is depicted with 36 helots. In the rear of this group, we have placed an estimated 6 tents, 1 for every 6 hoplites, as a rough approximation for the gear which accompanied the unit. This would have included things like spare weapons, armor, bedding, food, drink, and personal items. At the next level of the Spartan army organization, 2 Enomotiae would join together to form a Pentokostys of around 72 men. These would be led by a Pentakonta. While such a man likely held much social status among his peers, for our purposes, we will not dwell much on his rank as its broader details are not well documented. Accompanying the Pentokostys would have been the rest of its support staff and gear. In keeping with our prior assumption, this includes 72 helots and 12 regular tents, in addition to a new officer's tent, which we have assumed, but which may have not existed on account of the Spartan habit of treating all fighting men as equals. Next, 2 Pentokostai would join together to form a Lochos of around 144 men. These would be led by a Lochagos, whom we've once again depicted as being visually distinct, but would likely not have been in practice. In terms of experience, such men would have represented some of the city-state's most veteran leaders. Such was their importance that it was at the level of the Lochos that other hoplite militias, such as Athens, introduced their first organizational group and officer. To put some numbers behind this, an Athenian Lochos of around 200 men had one officer for a command ratio of about 0.5%. By contrast, our Spartan Lochos of 144 men had 7 officers for a command ratio of about 4.8%. This is a figure that rivals that of the Roman legions, though the latter benefited from a formation and doctrine which could be better leveraged by its low-level officers who were unshackled from the rigid phalanx. That being said, we can nonetheless see how the Spartan army was indeed unique in its level of control amongst its contemporary rivals. Moving on, now we will once more add the accompanying support staff and gear to our Lochos for proper logistical context. Here we see that our unit now has 144 helots, 24 regular tents, and 3 officer tents. The next unit of the Spartan army is the Mora, which was first mentioned in 403 BC. Its emergence was a part of the military reforms which followed the end of the Peloponnesian War, largely in response to manpower shortages. Here, Xenophon indicates that the Mora was formed by combining 4 Lochoi to achieve a total strength of 576 hoplites, which were further reinforced by a group of 100 cavalrymen for greater flexibility. This largest of Spartan tactical units was led by a Polmarchos. He stood as one of the most senior-ranking military officials and was certainly a man of high social standing, who was usually a descendant of the royal houses. On the battlefield, the Polmarchoi was said to have wielded near equal power to the kings, and while at home were responsible for both civil and judicial tasks. In practice, the Mora often acted independently. For instance, as Sparta sought to assert its dominance in the aftermath of its victory in the Peloponnesian War, permanent garrisons were stationed outside of Laconia. The task of managing these positions was rotated between the Spartan Morai. In addition, a Mora could also be expected to perform offensive action and might be the only Spartan contingent of a particular expedition. It should be noted that other Greek city-states of this period also began to recognize the usefulness of such mobile, strategic forces. This appears to have been partly responsible for the emergence of small, standing professional forces fielded by other polities such as the Theban Sacred Band. In recognition of the need for a Mora's relative independence, we will now be slightly modifying their associated support staff and gear to reflect this. Here you can see our previously mentioned helots. With 1 for each hoplite and 3 for each rider, they total 876. In addition, we have our tents, which feature 96 regular and 12 officer types. Added to this will be the new elements alluded to by Xenophon in the following passage, quote, In the first instance, the ephors proclaimed the limit of age to which service in the army applied for cavalry and heavy infantry, and, in the next place, for the various artisans. Such that, even on campaign, the Spartans are well supplied with all the conveniences enjoyed by people living as citizens in Sparta. All the implements and instruments which an army may need are ordered to be in readiness, some on wagons and others on baggage animals. In this way, anything omitted can hardly escape detection. Thus, we have chosen to grant a Mora an additional support element composed of roughly 50 donkeys, 25 carts, and 10 artisans. Once more, it must be said that this is an arbitrary count with little literary backing. Finally, we can bring together 6 of the Morai to form the main Spartan phalanx on campaign. Using our prior figures, they total 3,456 hoplites and about 600 cavalrymen, for a total of 4,056 soldiers. These would have been led by one of the 2 Spartan kings who accompanied the army in the field. By tradition, this leader was accompanied by the royal guard, whose numbers were set at 300 men. While in ages past this unit of Hippias may have been equestrian in nature, it now consisted of dismounted troops hand-selected on an annual basis from the most worthy of each year's graduating age groups of 20-year-olds. At least in theory. Once more, as the Spartan manpower supply dwindled, such a practice was not so easily maintained. We should also note that the organizational placement of this royal guard is subject of some doubt. Whether they were a part of the first Mora or existed independent of it is unknown. But what is fairly certain is that they were physically present wherever the king went. Another element of the army worth mentioning at this point will be the Skiritai. Unlike the Perioikoi, which were at times integrated into the Spartan units, the Skiritai would fight separately, as if they were allies and not subjects of Sparta. The cohesion of their small local levy, fixed at a strength of 600 men, made them a convenient force for use in a variety of roles, such as scouting and screening, for which the larger blocks of heavy infantry were less well equipped. Now let us add in all the baggage and support elements to get a full picture of our entire Spartan army model. Here we have included the roughly 5,300 helots which accompanied the hoplites and cavalry, as well as the roughly 650 tents which housed them. In addition, we have included the 300 donkeys, 150 carts, and 60 artisans which assisted with logistics. In reality, we might imagine additional allies, support forces, and camp followers. For the sake of this video, however, they have been excluded from our model. This is certainly an impressive force, which we can take a moment to appreciate visually. In terms of statistics, the total army depicted here is composed of almost 11,500 beings. Among these, about 92% are human and 8% are animals. When it comes to troop types, roughly 40% are infantry, 5% are cavalry, 2% are officers, and 53% are support. As an interesting point of comparison, we can add in the metrics for a Roman legion. Here you can see that it actually boasted a far greater proportion of combat troops, who were in turn led by a higher number of officers. But it is at this point that we should be reminded of a key fact. The Spartan army we have just described is but a model for a mere snapshot in time. In reality, the size and makeup of a Spartan army changed over time. This was largely a reflection of the available size of the citizen pool at any given time, and who was called out for a particular fight. Regarding population size, here is a graph estimating Sparta's citizen numbers over the years. For reference, the army model we have shown today dates to the late 5th century BC, after the end of the Peloponnesian War, and is, in part, as a response to these trends. Seeing this, one might be tempted to imagine the size of a Spartan army at its height of roughly 8,000 citizens. While certainly larger, we should be reminded that by comparison, Athens, at the middle of the 5th century BC, had around 40,000 male citizens who might be called up to join their militia. Just comparing these two should make us wonder how the Spartans ever stood a chance. The Spartan myth would have you believe that the Spartans were simply that much better. However, reality is more complicated than that, and a large factor in equalizing the number gap was that they simply had help from the others across Laconia and the wider Peloponnese. Especially as time went on, the Spartans increasingly relied on others to do the fighting for them. This would include diluting their own ranks with non-Spartiates, or taking command of allies and mercenaries by merely dispatching small officer groups. It was only when Spartan interests were directly threatened, or the reputation of Sparta itself was at stake, that their army would march out in full force. With this context in mind, let us now model what this would have looked like. The first place we might meet a Spartan army on campaign would be in its camp. The subject of Greek encampments is touched upon by several ancient sources. However, these are not enough to give us a definitive or comprehensive account of such matters. As a result, academics are left to argue for many interpretations. For further reading on this subject, we recommend Mauricio Rico's publication entitled The Greek Military Camp in the 10,000s Army. For our purposes, we will present a model inspired by Xenophon's description and some of the more agreed upon points by researchers. We will tackle this in 3 parts: the location, the camp defenses, the internal layout. When it comes to location, commanders would have sited their camps in locations which provided advantages in supply, logistics, and defense. This meant exploiting topographic features such as a river, high ground, or existing structures. Often, encampments were located on slopes, hills, or low mountain tops, which offered natural protection and extended vision. Such positions were quite easy to come by in rugged Greece. When it comes to camp defenses, it seems that the Greeks did not regularly build the same type of elaborate defenses as the Romans. This was in part due to the nature of the ground on which they fought, which was difficult to entrench upon, and which already boasted suitable natural defenses. But that is not to say that they never erected barricades. This was indeed done when needed, such as when a force established a garrison position or settled down for a long siege. In such cases, men would have turned to the environment for trees and vegetation with which to build their palisades. Yet, even basic camps were not undefended. Greek forces made ample use of guards and lookouts. Xenophon, in his description of the Spartan practice, describes 2 rings of security around their camp. The first ring was located at the perimeter of the camp and consisted of guard posts meant to control access to the area. Day watches reportedly kept an eye on the helots going about their duties within the camp, while night watches barred these same servants from entering while their masters slept. The second ring was located further out and consisted of lookouts and advanced units. The former would consist of mounted troops atop high-ground positions who would report back on any noteworthy observations. The latter consisted of allied forces, such as the Sciritae, who could intercept the army and raise the alarm. And finally, when it came to the internal camp layout, we know very little. In shape, they seem to have fit the dictates of their environment, with Xenophon writing that the idealized form for defense was circular rather than square. Polybius further remarks that they were not as standardized as their Roman counterparts. Yet we should not take this to mean that they were jumbled messes. Other sources point to some form of internal structure with features for rallying and mobilizing troops or even conducting gymnastics. Polyaenus explicitly states in his Stratagems in War, Book 2, Chapter 13, that the Lacedaimonians encamped in regular formation according to their regiments and Morai. Though from the later 2nd century AD, this passage does mirror some of the more contemporary organizational remarks of Xenophon. As the author Mauricio Rico succinctly puts it, quote, "We can accept that within the Greek camps each military unit encamped within a well-defined space, and the soldiers of different units did not mix, though this does not mean that there was a fixed layout for the camp. There was a plan, but this changed every time. The distribution would have created an internal network of streets with a regularity that we cannot know. When it came time to advance, the Spartans would have followed the calls of their superiors to break camp, to muster, and to begin the march. Let us now take a closer look at this process. Generally speaking, it seems that most Greek armies advanced in long, rather disorganized columns of march, which would have taken a long time to reform for battle. By contrast, the Spartans were noted for maintaining proper formations, especially whilst in the enemy's country. Should the full army be present, this likely would have meant having the cavalry and screening light troops in the front, followed by the king and the first Mora, then each of the following Morai. Xenophon specifically spends time explaining to his fellow Greeks how Spartan drill allowed them to efficiently evolve such marching columns into battle lines. This was achieved by having the leading unit take up position at the right end of the battlefield, with each following unit taking its place beside them. Given the fact that the Spartans had officers down to the level of the 36-man Enomotia, their level of command and control would have made this process much more manageable. For instance, here we show how the various Enomotarchs might direct their men into a phalanx of a desired frontage and depth. While it might seem like a complex operation from above, the sequencing on the ground means that each leader simply has to orient himself relative to how the unit ahead of him is moving. The men of each unit, in turn, have only to follow their leader. In this way, the army organism as a whole is capable of conducting seemingly complex maneuvers with only basic guidance. Here is another view of how a formation could be countermarched to face a unit to their rear. Apparently, this could be achieved in the face of the enemy. Such a feat was unheard of among their peers and certainly warranted praise. As for the nature of the battle line itself, this is actually a point of some contention. While our sources often mention formation depths when describing battles, they leave us in the dark on the actual distances involved. Scholars are therefore divided on the spacing of the hoplites and how this fits into larger models for how combat actually took place. Schools of thought range from the more tightly packed and rigid formation of troops that might engage in a rugby-like shoving match to the more loose and fluid formation of troops capable of intermittent spear fencing and skirmishing. Besides these are many more possible models with all kinds of idiosyncrasies. But such a discussion will be beyond the scope of today's video. For our purposes, we have opted to depict a Spartan army where each man stands roughly 1 meter side to side and is arranged to a depth of 9 hoplites. In this manner, we find that the smallest unit of the 36-man Enomotia is split into 4 files, which occupy around 4 meters of the front. The entire Spartan phalanx can therefore be found to stretch out over 400 meters. We should note that such a formation on its own is quite small and is subject to being outflanked. In response, a commander may choose to rearrange his files to achieve a wider frontage. Doing so, however, compromises his depth and therefore his unit's staying power. Facing this dilemma, it will be important for any army to call upon allied hoplites to widen the phalanx, whilst also using light troops and cavalry to protect the vulnerable flanks. As Greek warfare continued to evolve over the years, new methods of equipping and organizing troops would lead to an arms race of innovation meant to crack the earlier code. It is from this competition that would emerge the Macedonian army with its distinct Sarissa armed phalanx and shock cavalry force. But its true size will have to be covered another time. For now, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of the Spartan Army. For script previews, art downloads, and more, please consider supporting us on Patreon. A big thanks to the current patrons for supporting the channel and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.